At 6:42 on the morning of July 17, 1944, Private First Class Daniel Reed crouched behind a splintered hedgerow outside Saint-Lô, France, with more wire in his hands than any sane infantryman wanted to carry this close to the front line. 24 years old, former small-town electrician from Ohio, 0 confirmed kills, and responsible for the ugliest ball of improvised copper on the entire Cotentin Peninsula. 280 yards in front of him, beyond a churned field and a shallow depression filled with smoke, a German 88mm gun sat dug into the ruins of a stone farmhouse. For 3 days, that gun and 2 machine gun nests had held up the advance of the 2nd Infantry Division. Every time American tanks tried to nose forward, the 88 cracked, and another Sherman brewed up at the crossroads. By midnight, the wrecks made a grotesque barricade of twisted armor and burned rubber. Reed belonged on a telephone line, not a battlefield. He had been trained to string field wire between command posts, to repair handsets and magnetos, to keep officers talking. But the front around Saint-Lô had chewed through radios, batteries, and signalmen alike. Somewhere between the hedgerows and the artillery, the clean diagrams from signal school had been replaced by improvisation and prayer. 3 days earlier, a German shell had destroyed the platoon's standard blasting machine, the heavy green box with its familiar handle, the approved way to send current into demolition caps. The engineers had explosives. They did not have a safe way to set them off from a distance. Reed did. Sort of. In the bivouac area 2 miles back, under a drooping U.S. flag nailed to a shattered barn, he had spent nights twisting copper wire, scavenging springs from broken M1 rifles, cannibalizing parts from a ruined field telephone and the switch of a truck's headlight system. The result looked less like official U.S. Army equipment and more like a bird's nest wrapped around a pocket knife. The other men called it Reed's rat's nest. The company commander called it a liability. The battalion S3, a major who had never seen a live demolition cap before Normandy, had squinted at the coils and clips and asked if Reed planned to defeat the Wehrmacht or electrocute himself. But yesterday afternoon, in a shallow pit behind the lines, Reed's device had fired 3 practice charges in a row from 50 yards away. No standard blasting box, no factory switch, just a web of wire, a salvage crank, and Reed's stubborn belief that electricity didn't care whether it traveled through government-issue hardware or a jury-rigged contraption, so long as the circuit closed. Now headquarters wanted to know if his rat's nest could clear a path where artillery had failed. The plan was simple on paper. Under cover of early morning smoke, a squad of engineers would crawl forward, pack TNT against the retaining wall beneath the stone farmhouse, and snake Reed's wire back to the hedgerow. Once everyone was clear, they would trust a handmade device and a nervous private to send enough current through that line to drop the wall, bury the 88, and open the crossroads. If it worked, the advance toward Saint-Lô would resume. If it failed, the German gun crew would still be alive, the road would still be blocked, and the men in the hedgerow would be silhouetted against the dawn like targets on a range. Reed wiped the sweat off his palm onto his field jacket. The air smelled of wet dirt and cordite. Smoke from the artillery screen rolled low across the ground, gray and yellow, thick enough that he could not quite see the stone farmhouse, but thin enough that the 88 crew might see them if they moved too fast. He looked at the improvised device resting in the mud beside him, a wooden box the size of a mess tin, wrapped with loops of copper wire, its crude contacts protected by a rag that had once been part of a U.S. flag snapped off a truck antenna. 2 long leads disappeared into the smoke, snaking toward the German position. Behind Reed, Captain Walker knelt with binoculars pressed to his face, helmet pushed back, jaw tight. "Remember, Reed," Walker said quietly. "One squeeze. You get one clean shot at this before they figure out we're here." Reed nodded. In his mind, he saw diagrams, voltages, resistance values. In his gut, he felt only the weight of 70 men lying in the hedgerow, waiting to find out whether the weird little device they had laughed at would deliver enough electricity to change the course of their morning, or get them all killed. If you want to see whether Reed's improvised wire-made device actually worked under real German fire, hit that like button. It tells YouTube that stories like this are worth hearing, and it helps us pull more forgotten moments out of dusty archives. And if you haven't already, consider subscribing so you don't miss the rest of this mission. Back to Reed. The engineers had gone forward at 5:58, just as the first American barrage walked shells across the far edge of the field. Reed only saw them for a few seconds. Dark shapes with heavy packs, hunched low, moving from crater to crater. Then the smoke swallowed them. He checked his watch. The second hand ticked loudly in his imagination, even if the actual sound was drowned out by artillery and distant machine gun bursts. The plan gave the engineers 30 minutes to reach the farmhouse, plant the charges, and get clear. Reed used the time the way he always did when nerves threatened to shake his hands. He ran through the circuit in his head. The standard M3 blasting machine created a brief surge of current when the operator slammed the handle down. Reed couldn't replicate the exact mechanism, but he understood the principle. His device used the magneto from a ruined field telephone, driven by a short crank salvage from a truck jack. The current ran through a set of contacts pulled from a flashlight switch and reinforced with a spring and trigger guard from a broken M1. Turn the crank, press down, close the contacts. Current surges through the twin copper lines and into the blasting cap crimped onto the TNT. If the connections were solid, if the insulation held, if the magneto hadn't been damaged in last night's rain, somewhere under that farmhouse a tiny bridge wire would glow white-hot for a fraction of a second. Theoretically, at 6:21, an engineer's voice crackled in Reed's headset. They had run a single field phone line out with the explosive wire, just in case. Wires in place, the voice whispered. Charges set. We're pulling back. Reed glanced at Captain Walker. The captain lowered the binoculars, eyes narrowed against the smoke. Time delay? Walker asked. No delay, sir, Reed said. Instantaneous. When I crank, they blow. Walker nodded. Then wait for my signal. I want that smoke as thick as it's going to get. The seconds stretched. Twice, the German gun fired blindly through the haze, the flash of the muzzle buried deep in the farmhouse opening. Each blast slammed air across the field, shredding patches of smoke before more drifted in from the artillery burst beyond. Reed found himself staring at his left hand, at the dirt ground into the grooves of his fingerprints, at the frayed edge of the flag cloth wrapped around the device. Back in Ohio, he had wired up barn roofs and porch lights, had crawled through half-finished houses threading cable through studs. The worst thing that could happen, there was a blown fuse or a singed eyebrow. Reed, Walker said softly, you with me? Yes, sir. Walker dipped his head once sharply. Do it. Reed wrapped his right hand around the small crank, his left hand around the improvised handle that closed the contacts. He felt the smoothness of oiled metal against callous skin, the faint give of the spring under his thumb. He took a breath, then another, counting, because that's what he did when he needed his body to obey. 1, 2, 3. On 4, he began to turn. The magneto hummed faintly inside the wooden box. Reed pressed down, closing the circuit. For 2 heartbeats, nothing changed. Then the farmhouse disintegrated. The explosion came not from the gun's mouth, but from its roots. The stone wall beneath the gun emplacement bulged outward, then burst in a spray of rock and dark earth. The 88 flipped sideways, carriage twisting as if some giant hand had yanked it off its mounts. A thick, dirty blossom of smoke and dust roared up, swallowing the house, the gun, the nearby hedgerow, all in one convulsive movement. The shock wave hit the hedgerow like a solid slap. Reed felt it in his teeth. A fraction of a second later, debris rained down across the field. Chunks of stone, splintered timber, a twisted segment of metal shield tumbling end over end. The men around Reed cheered, some of them whooping, others laughing in short, disbelieving bursts. Someone clapped him on the back, so hard his helmet slipped down over his eyes. Jesus, Reed, one of the riflemen shouted. You just kicked that Kraut gun into next week. Captain Walker didn't cheer. He pressed the binoculars to his eyes, scanning the ruin through thinning smoke. Guns down, he said finally. I see at least one will pointing at the sky. No movement. He turned to Reed. Behind the war grime and the stubble, there was the faintest trace of a smile. Nice work, Private. Your rat's nest did its job. Reed exhaled in a rush. His hands were still clenched around the box, knuckles white. Sir, he said, I'd like to check continuity on the lines before we move. Make sure we didn't shear anything. Walker raised an eyebrow. Expecting to use that thing again? Reed looked past him, toward the smoldering crossroads. Already, tank engines rumbled behind the hedgerow, waiting for the signal to move. The artillery might shift. So would the Germans. Sir, Reed said quietly, I don't think they only have one gun. Standard doctrine assumed defenders would sight overlapping fields of fire, would use one weapon system to mask another. Reed had patched enough radio chatter the last few days to know the Germans had been stubborn in this sector. Walker hesitated, then nodded slowly. All right, fast as you can. I want armor on that road the moment we're sure it's not a death trap. Reed pulled a small tool roll from his pouch, pliers, wire cutters, a battered ohm-meter he'd liberated from a maintenance tent. The shell bursts were farther away now. American guns were shifting fire deeper into the German rear. The smoke thinned, revealing what was left of the farmhouse, a low, jagged crater belching dust. As Reed clipped the ohm-meter leads onto his wire, he realized his hands had stopped shaking. The circuit was simple now. The device worked. The voltage flowed. It felt, in a strange way, like any other job. Diagnose, repair, prepare for the next problem. He just didn't yet know what that next problem would be. A Sherman nosed out from behind the hedgerow. Its turret already traversed toward the ruined farmhouse. The tank commanders had jutted from the hatch, goggles smeared with dust. Behind it, half-tracks and jeeps lurched forward, the whole column eager to pour through the gap that had cost them so much time and steel. For 300 yards, the advance went exactly as the staff officers would later describe it on paper. Deliberate, controlled, exploiting a breach in the enemy's defensive line. Then the second gun opened up. The first shell hit the lead Sherman on the glassy plate, just below the turret, with a white flash and the unmistakable metallic shriek of armor spalling. The tank shuddered, tracks grinding as it slewed sideways, then halted. Flames, licked from the drivers, hatched an instant later. The sound of the 88 was different when you knew it was firing at you. It had a sharp, almost obscene crack that rode on top of the boom, a sound that seemed to slice the air rather than push it. Down, someone shouted along the hedgerow, though most of the men were already flat. The second shell went long, detonating in a field beyond the road. The third hit the burned-out tank from the day before, blowing its turret clean off and sending it crashing into the ditch. Where is it? Walker snapped, binoculars already at his eyes. Reed squinted through the smoke and dust, scanning every gap in the hedgerow on the far side off the road, every shadow on the slopes beyond. If he had taken a guess before, he would have said any new gun was east of the crossroads, covering the same stretch of lane from a different angle. But doctrine didn't always survive contact with the map. A fourth shell tore into the column, this one catching a half-track and turning it into a brief, bright fireball. Screams followed, thin and high above the constant background of small arms fire. There! Walker barked. Far tree line, 11 o'clock. Concrete revetment halfway up the slope. They built a second nest behind the first. Reed followed the line of the captain's finger. At 800 yards, the enemy position was barely more than a darker rectangle against a hillside. A thin stroke of smoke marked each shot, a flash that was gone before human eyes properly registered it. Artillery? Reed asked. Walker shook his head once. Already busy, and they'll have that position well dug in. We'd need direct observation and time to adjust. We don't have either. He lowered the binoculars, looked at the tangle of wires at Reed's knees. Can you reach that far? Reed's first instinct, honed by years of crawling through attics and basements, was to calculate resistance over distance. 800 yards meant 1,600 yards of wire out and back. The magneto could push current that far, but only if every connection was clean, every splice tight. We don't have enough line, sir, he said. Not from here. Walker's jaw flexed. Then we get closer. The idea was insane and inevitable at the same time. Move a small team forward along the ditch beside the road, hugging the dead tanks and shell craters for cover, and set charges closer to the new German position. The closer they got, the less wire they needed. The less wire they needed, the more likely Reed's contraption could push enough current to do its job. Their field of fire is focused on the road, Walker said, half to himself, half to the men gathering around. They're watching armor. A few men in the ditch might get close if they're careful. Reed hadn't been issued careful as part of his kit, but he had been issued wire. And there was more of it, in the back of jeeps coiled on reels, wrapped around smashed field phones and abandoned telephone poles. He thought about saying no. thought about pointing out that he was a signalman, not Ranger Battalion. But then he remembered the sound of the first gun blowing apart under his fingertips. Remembered the way the tank column had rolled forward like a release spring, until the second 88 stopped them cold. "I'll go," he heard himself say. "If we can get demolition up there, I'll make the lines work." Walker didn't waste time pretending to argue. "Fine. You two engineers and a squad for cover. Take as much line and TNT as you can carry. Pick a starting point 300 yards out, then crawl." Within minutes, Reed found himself in the roadside ditch, the hedgerow behind him and the burning tanks ahead. The air in the ditch was hotter, thicker, full of the rich, greasy smell of burning fuel and the acrid tang of cordite. Flies were already gathering. He lay behind the wreck of an M10 tank destroyer, its open turret a blackened bowl, then looked back. A soldier with an assistance reel strapped to his back fed out wire as Reed moved. Another engineer hugged a satchel of TNT and caps. "All right," Reed whispered. "We go in bursts, not a steady crawl. Move when they fire. Freeze when they load." It was not standard infantry doctrine, but it was how he had learned to work around live wires and irritable foremen. Move when the noise covers you. The next shot came 30 seconds later. The muzzle blast from the distant 88 flashed on the hillside. Reed felt more than heard the shell go overhead, followed by an explosion somewhere behind the hedgerow. "Move," he hissed. They low-crawled 10 yards, stomachs scraping mud and gravel, boots pushing against the ditch wall. A corpse lay face down in the water ahead, uniform charred, helmet missing. Reed fought the urge to hold his breath as they slid past. Another shot, another blast. The rhythm began to form in Reed's head. The German crew was fast, but not inhuman. There were seconds between each round, seconds in which men could move if they didn't waste them. At roughly the 300-yard mark, Reed signaled a halt with 2 taps on the nearest boot. They huddled behind the burned-out shell of a Jeep, its frame twisted, tires gone. "Here," he whispered. "We set the first line here. If we have to fall back, we can still fire from the hedgerow." The engineers began packing TNT into the ditch wall facing the hillside. Planting it with a blast might at least chew a scar in the approach slope. It wasn't perfect. The 88 was still too far for a guaranteed kill. But the demolition could create debris, churn up earth, maybe force the Germans to reposition. Even a few minutes of silence from that gun could mean the difference between a stalled advance and a breakthrough. Reed knelt in the muddy water and started twisting wire. Every connection mattered now. He stripped insulation with his teeth, wrapped copper ends tightly, soldered where he could with a pocket iron and a small battery he'd insisted on carrying since Sicily. Above them, another shell screamed out, passing low enough that Reed felt the hair on his neck prickle. "Let's go," he said. "We've got enough for a second charge closer in. We push until we can't." He didn't say the obvious, but there would come a point where the ditch ended, where the only cover was whatever shape the land offered, and the bodies already there. They moved again in awkward, jerking bursts timed to the thunder of the German gun. At 400 yards, the ditch shallowed. At 500, it turned into little more than a depression. The field beyond sloped up toward the hillside, bare save for scattered shell craters and the black silhouettes of ruined farm wagons. Reed pressed himself into the damp earth, chest heaving, eyes fixed on the distant concrete slot where the second 88 lived. Somewhere up there, men in gray uniforms were doing their own math, angles, velocities, rates of fire. Reed's math was simpler: distance, resistance, current. If they could get within 500 yards, and if he could salvage more line from the wrecks along the ditch, his improvised device might just reach far enough to send its invisible signal into German concrete again. But as he watched, a new plume of smoke rose not from the 88's position, but from a copse of trees on the hillside's flank. A smaller flash, lower to the ground, followed. "Mortars," one of the engineers whispered. The Germans weren't content to sit behind their gun anymore. They were reaching out, probing the ditch, guessing that Americans might be trying something clever. Reed realized they weren't the only ones adapting. The first mortar rounds fell short, walking explosions along the far side of the road. Dirt and fragments rained down into the ditch. Reed flinched as something hard pinged off his helmet. "They're feeling for us," he said. "If they bracket the ditch, this whole line becomes a trench full of shrapnel." "Then we'd better make it count," one of the engineers muttered. They stopped at a shallow dogleg in the ditch, a bend that offered a sliver of protection from the hillside. Reed's mental map of the field sharpened. Hedgerow behind, wrecked vehicles ahead, German gun at 1 o'clock, mortar section maybe at 2. He made a decision that would have made any safety inspector in Ohio faint. Strip everything, he said. Every bit of wire off these wrecks. Vehicle lights, radios, anything. We're turning this ditch into a single ugly extension cord. For 10 frantic minutes, they worked like grave robbers. Reed yanked headlight assemblies out of fenders, tore harnesses from shattered dashboards, rolled insulated cable into loops. The assistant with a line reel tied everything together, splicing thick, rubber-coated automotive wire into the thinner field line Reed had brought from the hedgerow. Mortar rounds crept closer. One exploded in the road itself, blowing a jagged hole where asphalt had once been. Another dropped behind them, close enough that the concussion slammed Reed's face into the ditch wall. He spat dirt, blinked gritty tears away, and forced his hands back to the wires. Resistance is resistance, he told himself. Copper is copper. Keep the joins tight, and the current will flow. When they finally had a continuous line running back toward the hedgerow, part field wire, part truck harness, part stolen German signal cable, Reed felt the fatigue in his fingers more than in his legs. Every knuckle ached. His palms were raw. Is this enough? The younger engineer asked, eyes wide. Reed looked up the slope. The second 88 barked again, spitting fire at another tank trying to nose forward behind the burning wrecks. The shell hit, and the tank stopped moving. It has to be, Reed said. They placed the last of their TNT at a slight rise in the field, the closest piece of cover they could find. It wasn't right on top of the gun position, but it was at least within a radius where blast and shrapnel might chew into the revetment, kick debris into firing apertures, force the crew to close up or abandon the site. As they wired the caps, Reed felt a strange calm settle over him. The choices were made. The line either worked or it didn't. For all its improvised splices and mismatched gauges, the circuit was complete. Back, he ordered, fast as you can, but stay low. They crawled, then stumbled, then half ran down the ditch, hunched against the concussions of mortar rounds bracketing their path. Twice, Reed tripped over bodies he hadn't seen. Once he heard the metallic whine of a mortar fragment skimming along the ditch wall inches from his ear. At last, the hedgerow loomed ahead, dark and solid and full of American helmets. Hands reached down, hauled them up and over. Reed rolled into his previous firing position, chest heaving, lungs burning. The improvised blasting box lay where he had left it, mud drying in a rough crust around its edges. The twin leads that now snaked back toward the hillside were thicker than before, patched and knotted and ugly. Captain Walker crouched beside him. Tell me this will work, Reed. Reed swallowed. For a moment, the whole battlefield narrowed to the wooden box between them. Smoke, flames, screaming steel. They faded to a muffled roar. It'll work, he said. If the line holds, it'll work. Walker nodded once. Then let's send them a message. Reed wrapped his fingers around the crank, feeling the familiar resistance of the magneto. His left hand settled on the trigger switch, thumb resting on the scavenged rifle spring. He closed his eyes just long enough to see the circuit in his mind. Magneto to contacts to wire to charges. A loop of copper stretching through mud and wreckage to a hump of explosives, staring up at a German gun that thought it on the road. He opened his eyes. Firing, he said aloud. To whoever was listening, he cranked. The box hummed against his palms. He pressed down, closing the circuit. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then, halfway up the hillside, the earth rose in a dirty, jagged fountain. The explosion was deeper than the farmhouse blast had been, more contained. Instead of a building flying apart, it was as if the ground itself had coughed. Dirt and rock and concrete fragments erupted upward, followed by a smaller secondary detonation from inside the gun pit itself. The 88's concrete revetment sagged. One end of the gun barrel dropped, then seesawed, then disappeared into the cloud. The mortar fire stopped almost immediately. For long seconds, the hillside was a confused smear of dust and drifting smoke. Along the hedgerow, the effect was electric. Men yelled, fist pumping. Someone fired his rifle into the air until Sergeant grabbed the barrel, and shoved it down. Walker lowered his binoculars slowly. "Their guns out," he said. "I see men running. No more muzzle flashes." He turned to Reed, and this time the smile wasn't faint. "Private Reed," he said, "remind me never to complain about your wiring again." Reed let out a long breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. His hand shook now that the crank was still. Somewhere behind them, an officer shouted orders. Tank engines revved. The column would move again. Men would write reports and maps would change color, and in some air-conditioned headquarters a continent away, someone would draw a neat arrow with a greased pencil over the crossroads outside St. Lo. No one would note in the after-action summary that the arrow existed because one exhausted signalman had believed a tangled mess of wire and scrap metal could reach farther than anyone thought reasonable. This is development. Part 3, Climax Resumido. Number Rotero Completo. Ainda haveria mais algumas cenas de perseguico. Contra-ataque e impacto nos dias seguintes. Para o teste. Viderido para a concluso. The official history of the 2nd Infantry Division would later devote exactly 2 sentences to the fight for the crossroads outside St. Lo. The language was clean and distant. Enemy anti-tank resistance was overcome by determined infantry armor cooperation. The division resumed its advance toward the city. It did not mention the improvised wire-made device built from a cannibalized field telephone and truck parts. Within the regiment, the story spread anyway. Men who had watched the farmhouse vanish beneath Reed's first blast, who had seen the hillside choke on dust when the 2nd 88 went silent, carried the tale forward. Someone started calling the box Reed's Lightning. Someone else drew it on the side of a ration crate with red arrows pointing to the tangle of wire, like a field expedient instruction manual. A week later, another platoon signalman showed up at Reed's foxhole carrying a magneto from a broken phone and a box of scrap metal. "Mind showing me how you did it?" he asked. Reed didn't feel like a hero. He felt tired and sore and several days behind on sleep. But he sat up, took the parts, and began to talk through the circuit. How to route current, how to keep connections dry, how to test continuity before anyone trusted their life to a homemade box. By August, there were half a dozen similar devices scattered through the battalion, each one slightly different, each one born of the same combination of desperation and basic electrical theory. The engineers still preferred standard blasting machines, but standard equipment had a habit of disappearing between shipping manifests and frontline foxholes. Reed survived Normandy, the push across France, and the frozen nightmare of the Hurtgen Forest. He came home in late 1945 with a Good Conduct Medal, a combat infantryman badge, and a small scar along his left forearm where a mortar fragment had grazed him that day in the ditch. He went back to Ohio and to electricity, this time in factories and power plants instead of hedgerows. He married, raised 2 children, wired schools and hospitals and grocery stores. On some nights, when lightning strobed across Midwestern skies and the power flickered, he found himself remembering the feel of a damp wooden box between his hands and the way the earth had leaped when the circuit closed. Decades later, a retired colonel doing research for a divisional history tracked Reed down. They exchanged letters. Reed dug an old cardboard box out of his attic and found, beneath faded photographs and a worn-out field manual, a sketch he had made in 1944 of his improvised detonator. Little more than lines and scribbled notes, arrows pointing to the magneto and contacts. The colonel asked if he could donate the sketch and a reconstructed device to a museum display on battlefield improvisation. Reed agreed on one condition, that the placard mention not his name, but the job description. "Signalman's improvised firing device," he wrote in his reply. "That's all it ever was. Today, if you walk through certain military museums, you might pass a small glass case. Inside sits a plain wooden box wrapped in loops of wire, with a weathered U.S. flag folded behind it. A pair of bright red arrows on the diagram point to the crude contacts and the magneto crank. Most visitors walk past without stopping. To them, it looks like a broken prop from some forgotten movie. A mess of wire, nothing more. But it is not. It represents a moment when a soldier with no official blueprint, no approved equipment, and no guarantee of success reached into the chaos of war with a handful of scrap and pulled out a working solution. A device that let current travel 800 yards through mud and metal and wreckage to silence a gun that had already killed too many men. In a war measured in divisions and tonnage and square miles liberated, one burst of electricity along a homemade line might seem small. But for the tank crews who rolled through that crossroads alive, for the infantry who followed, it was everything. If this story moved you the way it moved us, do me a favor. Hit that like button. Every single like tells YouTube to show this story to more people who care about the ingenuity and courage of ordinary soldiers in impossible situations. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications, because we're rescuing forgotten stories like this from dusty archives every single day. And drop a comment right now and tell us where you're watching from. Are you in the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia? Somewhere else entirely? Did someone in your family ever serve in a war, string field wire, or work as an electrician? You're not just a viewer. You're part of keeping these memories alive. Let us know you're here.